So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And now we pick up in chapter 2. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelek, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Well, go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelek. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" And Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Well, blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead," she added. "The man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
I wonder if you've ever been in a tough spot, a time of suffering, and you've been really touched by the extraordinary kindness of other people. Perhaps when no one else would, someone listened to your deepest anxieties. Or there was someone who was willing to pray for you in your challenges. Or maybe you were in a position of financial difficulty and someone gave to you generously without expecting you to pay them back. In our darker moments, we often find out who our true friends are, don't we? And sometimes, just as we figure out who our true friends are, it can feel a little bit like our true friends are human. Whereas God, it's hard to really tell what he's doing in our tough times, isn't it? We read verses like the one Peter mentioned at the start of our service that say the Lord will be with those who are in trouble, but it can be sometimes difficult to see that. Our friends, they're making meals, they're visiting us in hospital, they're giving us a phone call, but God's moving in mysterious ways that we just don't see. I wonder if Naomi felt like that. Remember what she said. The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Could it be that God's doing something good in her situation? Well, in the chapter that Ben's just read for us, there are two shining lights of kindness, human kindness, Boaz and Ruth. And we're going to think about the amazing ways that they helped Naomi. And we'll see by the end of the chapter that Naomi was grateful for them, especially for Boaz. But behind the kindness of those people, we actually see that through human kindness, God was at work. And maybe if we understand that in Naomi's story, we can start to see through the actions of our Christian brothers and sisters and those around us that God is at work in our lives too. Now today we're going to go through this passage a little different than usual. Normally we sort of go through it with the points, kind of tying it to our applications. Now, I think the main point for us to learn from this story, generally, they don't really follow the verses systematically, but I do want to make sure we get the story. So we're going to split it a bit like this. We're going to have half our time just going through this story, making sure we understand it. And then at the end, we'll be thinking about what it means for us. So if it feels really irrelevant, just hang in there. We'll get there. But it's a lovely story nonetheless, isn't it? A great encouraging story. So chapter 2, verse 1, we read, Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelek, whose name was Boaz. There's a big hint there that guy's going to be important. It's a bit like when you read The Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, and it starts, Marley was dead to begin with. And you know that man is going to be significant. Well, it's the same here. There's something important about this man, Boaz. Naomi and Ruth need a family member to care for them, and here is one. And so our eyes are peaked up, our ears are sort of pricked up to see if there's going to be a way he will help. Now, at that same moment, Ruth, completely unaware of this man, is hardworking and goes out to the fields. She doesn't wait to be asked. She says, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour. Now, those of you who know your Old Testament, you might know that God provided for this sort of thing. So Leviticus 19:9 says to landowners, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and foreigner. So the idea was that you did your farming, but rather than making sure you picked up every last piece of grain, the leftovers was kind of left on the floor for the poor to eat. I guess the closest equivalent for us today is when you go to a shop and you get your kind of 2p change that you're never going to use, and you put it in the collection bucket, and all those 2p's eventually add up to a reasonably significant amount. Well, this is the ancient equivalent. It wasn't a great job. It was long, hard work, discouraging work, and really gleaning was only a step above begging. We also figure out from this passage that it must have been dangerous for a woman to do, because twice there is mention that Ruth in other fields would have been harmed. But despite this danger, despite this really low job that she was being asked to do, she goes out to work. And we're told, as it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz. Now, if you read the Bible enough, you'll know that when something just turns out to happen, it means really God is in control. He leads her to Boaz's field. And we kind of see, from the moment Boaz turns up on the scene, that God has already been there in Boaz's field. Boaz is clearly a man of God. Of course, the Lord be with you could just be a phrase. But I think we're told about it because the author wants us to pick up that this is a man for whom even his greetings, even his hellos are shaped by the Lord's. He is a man of God. Now, he sees that there's a woman in his field that he's never recognized before. And so he asks his overseer who she is. And this overseer gives a glowing report of this woman from Moab. Verse 7. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Farming work's hard work. If you've ever done it, it's hard. It's even harder if you're working in hot Israel. She must be exhausted. She has kept working from morning, from when she arrived until now. Boaz is impressed by this and he welcomes Ruth as a daughter. My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. I think when he calls her daughter, that's not just a phrase, a bit like when an old man says son to someone that's playing football or something like that. I think he's recognizing that since she is now part of the family through Naomi, he has a responsibility to care for her. I think it's also worth noting at this point, those of you who know the story know that Ruth and Boaz get married eventually. But I don't think we should read into this that Boaz was working the field and trying to get Ruth to like him. No, he isn't being kind because he's taken a shine to her. He's being kind because he recognizes it's his responsibility. You'll notice in chapter 3, it's Ruth who has to do the proposing because Boaz is very shocked that such a young woman would take an interest in him. No, he isn't trying to get Ruth to marry him. He's just being a godly and kind man for the sake of Ruth and for the sake of Naomi. And that's borne out by his actions. He lets her work in his fields, taking the plants that could have been his. He keeps her safe, promising he will make sure his men don't do her harm. And he also offers her his water. Now, we kind of expect someone to offer us water. In fact, if you go to a restaurant, if you ask for tap water, they kind of look at you down the nose, don't they? But in those days, it required a long, hard walk, as he mentions. His men had to go and get the jars of water. It's a bit like if you've ever been on a long hike or a long piece of exercise and someone asks for your water. It's quite hard to give up because you've only got that water left. But Boaz shares his drink and later his food. Ruth's bowled over by this kindness. Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you should notice me, a foreigner? And he replies, verse 11, I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. Ruth's reputation precedes her. She's left the ungodly Moabites and she's come through Naomi to be part of the people of God. And then once again we get a blessing pronounced on Ruth. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Yes, there's a sense of reward of God blessing her for blessing Naomi. There's also the sense of Ruth taking refuge, hiding in the shelter of God's wing, like a bird keeping its chicks safe. Yahweh is pictured as a bird keeping safe Ruth. And this doesn't lead Boaz to assume that Ruth will be taken care of. No, it leads him to respond by giving that care himself. On the lunch break, he shares his lunch with her. He gives orders to his men in verses 15 to 16 to let her take grain straight from the stalk, which would only be allowed for a family member, not a gleaner. And in case Ruth was too polite to do that herself, they were to pick some up and throw them on the ground to make sure she was going home with the best grain. Boaz treats Ruth as a member of the family. She's part of Israel. She's part of his clan now. She's part of his family now. And he's going to make sure she is taken care of. We're told Ruth gleaned until the evening, a long and a hard day's work. And she comes back with an ephah, which is 13 kilograms or 2 stone of barley. An astonishing amount in a day. For that to happen, Ruth must have worked really hard, and Boaz must have been extraordinarily generous. When she gets home, understandably, Naomi is shocked. Who could have been this kind? Verse 19, Ruth reveals that it's Boaz, and verse 20, Naomi says, "The Lord bless him. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. That man is our close relative. He's one of our guardian redeemers." I think the one it says that is spoken of as not stopping showing kindness there is probably more likely Boaz than God, although it could be either. More likely in the sentence structure, I'm told that it's referring to Boaz. So Boaz deserves a blessing because he remembers his obligation to his brother and his brother's sons to care for their wives when they're gone. But of course, God is working in and through Boaz. So in a sense, both the Lord and Boaz have not ceased showing kindness to the living and the dead. And then we get that new phrase there, guardian redeemer. I'm probably going to say kinsman redeemer because that's what the Bible I grew up with used to say. But the idea is that someone in your family who rescues you when you're in trouble. If you were in slavery, a kinsman redeemer was expected to bail you out. If you were in debt, they were expected to be your guarantor. As we'll see later in the book, this would lead to Boaz taking long-term responsibility for Naomi and Ruth. Now, Naomi ends this passage safely planning for Ruth to go back to the safety of Boaz's field. And we close the chapter with her being there until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished, which I'm told are 2 separate harvests that would have taken from April to June. So there's a fair amount of security for these 2 women. But there is a bit of an uncertainty as the passage ends. What will happen after these harvests are finished? And we'll have to find out the answer to that next time. But the big message is clear. We ended with Naomi feeling afflicted by God that nothing was going right for her. And we wonder what God's going to do for this poor woman. Yet God's hidden hand is at work again. Through Ruth's hard work and Boaz's generosity, God has been at work to provide food for Naomi. And he has sheltered the foreigner Ruth and treated her like a full daughter of the kingdom. There are still questions to be worked out in the rest, but we are beginning to see God at work in Naomi's life. Now then, I told you we'd tell you the story, and then we think about what we should take from this passage. And I think there's 4 separate things. First of all, you should see God's hidden hand in human kindness. See God's hidden hand in human kindness. We talked last time about God's hidden hand, and we said that Naomi couldn't always see it, and that we often ourselves won't always see it. But something that we do see is the hand of human kindness. And that is a pale reflection of what God is actually doing for us behind the scenes. God knew that Boaz was an honourable man. And he made sure it turned out that Ruth went to the field of this honourable man, not any of the other scumbags that were around about. Clearly, Boaz is a perfect means of God's kindness. He is a guardian redeemer. He is a family member. He is a godly and kind man. He has family members who came from outside Israel into Israel. And he's willing to pray a blessing over Ruth. Yet with all these things, Boaz isn't just the right man in theory, he's the right man in action. And God makes sure that Naomi and Ruth are provided for. Ruth took refuge in Naomi and her God, and God honored that taking of refuge by providing exactly what she needed through the kindness of Boaz. Now, last week, our family brought along a present for Jacob. I hope you're doing okay at home, Jacob. And Lucy and Josh gave Jacob the gift. But Paul, later in the day, sent me a text. And he said, "Oh, thank you for the present you got for Jacob." Obviously, it wasn't me. It was Nat. I assume Becky also texted Nat as well to say thank you. But why did that happen? Well, there's kind of a realization that although Joshy and Lucy walked across the room holding the present, really, the present had come from someone else. And that's what we see here. Boaz is, as it were, the one bringing the gift. But the gift originally comes from God. When we're in suffering, human kindness is often easier to see. The friend who comes and sits with us by the hospital bed. The family member who listens compassionately to your struggles all night long. The small group praying faithfully for you week after week after week. And it's great to see those people. It's great to give thanks for those people. We see many in this passage doing that to those who have helped them. But we should also see God at work in those acts of human kindness. It is God who has led us to be with those people who will care for us and love us. Now, of course, not every Christian is as kind as Boaz. But frequently, there's something that we can see in the people around us that help us to see the way that God is caring for us too. And that's not just for those in the community. No, often the kindness of Christians is something that draws people from the outside in. I think I've told you the story before, a simple story really, of a man I met once who became a Christian because of a leaky pipe. He was off on his holidays and he got a phone from his neighbours to say that a pipe had burst and his entire downstairs was flooded. He came back from his holiday and they put him up in their house. They got involved to rescue as much as they could. And in all these acts of kindness, the man thought, what is it with these people? Why are they being so extraordinarily kind? Now, they ever actually told him that they were Christians, but he managed to figure it out for himself. And he was determined to go to church to find out what this was all about. And he eventually came to believe. When we see kindness in Christians, whether we're in the community or out of it, we're seeing the kindness of God that should lead us back to him. So secondly, to a lesser extent really, we see both Ruth and Boaz are means by which God is working, but they're also examples to us. And let's consider each one by one. Let's start with Boaz, who's an example that we should use high status for kindness. Use high status for kindness. Boaz recognizes that Ruth has come to seek refuge under the God of Israel, but that doesn't lead him, as we've already mentioned, to assume that she's going to be taken care of by someone else. James warns us about praying for people, doesn't he? And not actually providing for them. And Boaz is a man not just of prayer, not just of good wishes, but a man of action. He is wealthy. He does have a high status, and that means that he can be a tool of God's kindness in Naomi's life. When it comes to money, Christians tend to swing between two extremes. On the one hand, we can believe that having wealth is a sign of God's blessing, which is so obviously not true. Otherwise, we could look at the rich list that's produced every year and see the most honourable people in society, and that clearly is not the case. But on the other hand, we can swing to the opposite extreme and assume that because someone has wealth and position, then they have compromised their morality to get there. No, wealth and positions in society are just tools. They can be used for good, they can be used for evil. It's not evil to own your own company or own your own farm in this culture, or to have a healthy bank balance, or to have an established status in the community. The question is, what are you going to use that gift that God has given you for? Having money can give you great opportunities for human kindness. It can lead you to give substantial support to missionaries overseas, or to help out family and friends when they're in a spot of difficulty. It can help you, if you own your own business, to create new jobs so that people are able to support their own families. If we really believe that it's more blessed to give than receive, then we'll be desperate to use the money we have for that kind of purpose. Now, that doesn't mean you're to give all your money away and live in a cardboard box, but it does mean that you're to have your eyes open for opportunities for human kindness. Similarly, having positions of leadership in the home, in the workplace, in the church, in government, these are positions to use for good. A Christian father should, like Boaz, look at his close family and his wider family and consider the ways he can bless that sphere. A Christian boss isn't going to be a pushover, but he will certainly be fair and generous with staff. And a Christian leader won't insist on his own way, but carefully consider what is best for the whole. Leadership is an opportunity to bless others, not to use for selfish gain. We actually have a great example of that just up the road. Maybe you can look at it as we go to the car park. The houses that are just on the left of the car park I think they were built by Yoxall. I've not got Eve here to nod at me, but I'm pretty certain they were. And if you see on top of the houses, there are some words that are based on the Bible that say that treasures on earth should be used to gain blessings in heaven. And the man who built those houses built them for the poor. He had plenty, and he provided out of that wealth. Now, in my experience, many in this church are incredibly generous. And if generosity is doing its job, then it is often secret. So I expect there's many more examples of generosity that we don't see. But if we have positions of privilege, of money, of authority that we can use to bless others, let's look for those opportunities. Use high status for kindness. But of course, Ruth gives us an example too, doesn't she? And she shows us the example of using hard work for kindness as well. Ruth doesn't have the money to care for Naomi. She doesn't have a position of authority and status, but what she does have is two good hands and a younger body than Naomi. So she gets to work. Hard work, dangerous work, undignified work, but work nonetheless. Not everyone has the ability to be generous with their money. Not everyone has high status that they can affect government decisions. But many of us do have the ability to work if we choose to. A number of you have noted, as we've talked about this passage, how encouraging it is that the Bible has this picture of feminine hard work. The world at the time of Ruth, think of the Greek myths. They're all about kings and generals and heroes. If a woman's in a story, it's generally because she's a beautiful queen or because she's a villain. How countercultural the Bible is that this foreigner, this hardworking woman, is held in high regard by all who meet her. And Maggie pointed out to me earlier this week a talk that pointed out that the ideal wife of Proverbs 31 has a lot in common with Ruth. So, for example, in Proverbs 31, it says, she gets up while it is still night. She provides food for her family. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. And of course, the end of Proverbs 31 says, honor her for all that her hands have done, and let her works bring her praise at the city gates, which Boaz does. So it's good, this feminine hard work. But it's not just an example for the women, it's an example for all of us. The challenge of hard work through Proverbs and through the New Testament is woven in. Paul takes the Thessalonians to task because they aren't willing to go out on work. They rest on the goodwill of others. Christianity is not just about praying and reading scripture and doing spiritual things. Sometimes it's about turning up at the office or washing the dishes or looking after the kids. It's often to do with hard work for God's glory. So we should thank God for the evidences of that in our church. Many of you work long hours, earning an income so that you can support your family and be generous to others. That's a good thing. Others of you are industrious in the care of your family at home, and that's a good thing too. Others perhaps are in a different stage of life. You're retired, but you don't sit around watching TV all day. You think of ways to bless your family and your Christian family, and that's a good thing too. Even kids and young people and students, I hope that you will be working hard, and then if you have free time, using that for the good of others. Ruth's example should encourage us to look at ourselves. We shouldn't think, oh, if only I was richer, or if only I had a higher position. Rather, we should look at what we do have and think, how can I be proactive in kindness to others? Now, of course, as we're saying, there are human limits to this. Maybe as our lives go on, particularly as ill health sets in, it's harder and harder for us to do that. After all, we don't see Naomi carrying 2 stone of barley in from a field. But where we have that opportunity, we should be hardworking. And by that, even if it's not immediately obvious, we are God's means of grace to those around us. But of course, alongside the fact that there are examples here to follow, the big message of Ruth is the big message of the whole Bible. God is blessing the nations through his people Israel. And so the last thing I think we see in this passage is that we should seek refuge in our guardian Redeemer. Last time, Ruth chose to unite herself to Naomi. She chose to leave the gods of Moab, and she took up the God of Israel. As Boaz says, she took refuge under his wings. And what does she find God provides her with? Well, he provides her with a guardian Redeemer, a godly man, a leader among the people of God, who provides her with food and water and protection. Ruth sought protection in the God of Israel and found it through the person of a guardian Redeemer. Now, what we're seeking is not food and water and shelter, but we too have a kinsman Redeemer, one who we've been drafted into the family of, who will always provide us with what we need. One who took our debts and died for it on the cross. One who raises us to new life, giving us the bread of heaven that will last for all eternity. He is the head of the family that will never let any of its brothers and sisters fall. If you're outside that place of blessing, let Ruth's example encourage you. She was an outsider, and she came into the people of God. And what care she received. Ruth's blessing is just a pale reflection of the blessing that comes from our kinsman Redeemer, the Lord Jesus Christ. Just as she was fed, we will be spiritually fed. Just as she was protected, we will be spiritually protected. You have just so happened to be here in the field of Christ this morning. Don't go off to another field where someone could harm you, but cling to this guardian Redeemer, the Lord Jesus Christ. And Christians, notice what Ruth and Naomi do when they have found this guardian Redeemer. They don't say, well, let's go along to the next field, just in case they will be even more generous with us. No, they stick with him. They trust him. And as the story goes on, they will completely ally themselves with Boaz's welfare. And that's what we're to do. If we've found that we can be blessed in the Lord Jesus Christ, we shouldn't go wandering elsewhere. Let's stay close to Jesus. Let's trust him to provide for us. And if you do that, you will never be disappointed. When you came to Jesus, you sought refuge in him. As you leave this morning, may you be richly blessed under the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge.